Many men grow up believing that being a good man is not only morally correct, but also strategically sound in relationships. They are taught that kindness, reliability, emotional availability, and fairness naturally lead to respect, loyalty, and attraction. This belief is reinforced by social approval, cultural narratives, and advice that frames goodness as a universal solution. As a result, men learn to suppress assertiveness, avoid conflict, and prioritize harmony, assuming that these traits demonstrate maturity and strength. In most areas of life, this approach is rewarded. Cooperation builds trust, and fairness creates stable systems. However, in intimate relationships, the concept of being good often becomes distorted. Instead of expressing internal strength, goodness turns into compliance. Instead of confidence, it becomes avoidance. The man focuses on meeting expectations rather than setting direction. He gives without anchoring, accommodates without leading, and compromises without clarity. Initially, this behavior may feel appreciated, but over time it alters the dynamic. The relationship begins to revolve around emotional management rather than mutual attraction. The man believes he is doing everything right, yet he notices a gradual loss of respect, desire, or emotional responsiveness. This creates deep confusion because his identity is tied to the idea that goodness should produce positive outcomes. The issue is not kindness itself, but the absence of internal authority behind it. When goodness is not supported by presence, boundaries, and self-direction, it stops being strength and starts functioning as weakness. Understanding this distinction is uncomfortable because it forces a man to separate moral virtue from relational effectiveness. But without making this separation, he remains trapped in a pattern where his best intentions consistently undermine the very connection he is trying to preserve. The problem with the good man strategy is that it is often built on fear rather than strength, even when the man himself does not recognize it. Beneath the surface, many men adopt goodness as a way to avoid loss, conflict, or rejection. They believe that by being agreeable, emotionally available, and consistently accommodating, they can secure stability and approval. This creates a subtle transactional mindset. If I give enough, if I am patient enough, if I do everything right, I will be valued and chosen. The woman, however, does not experience this behavior as generosity or moral virtue. She experiences it as a lack of self-direction. When a man's actions are driven by the need to be liked or accepted, his presence becomes reactive rather than grounded. He adjusts himself to the relationship instead of anchoring it. Over time, this dynamic shifts the emotional balance. The woman becomes the point of reference, while the man becomes the one seeking reassurance. What initially felt supportive begins to feel constraining because it places emotional responsibility on her. She senses that his stability depends on her response, and this creates pressure rather than attraction. The man, unaware of this shift, often doubles down on goodness, believing that more patience, more understanding, and more emotional effort will restore balance. In reality, this reinforces the underlying problem. Attraction does not respond to need, even when that need is expressed politely or generously. It responds to internal stability and self-sufficiency. When goodness is used as a strategy to secure validation, it erodes respect rather than building it. The man becomes confused and resentful, feeling unappreciated for his efforts, while the woman feels emotionally burdened without fully understanding why. This cycle continues until the relationship either restructures itself or quietly deteriorates, leaving both sides frustrated by a dynamic neither consciously intended to create. What makes the good man pattern especially destructive is that it often feels invisible to the man himself, because it is reinforced by moral approval rather than questioned by results. He tells himself that patience is maturity, that self-sacrifice is strength, and that emotional restraint is evidence of character. In many social contexts, these qualities are praised, which makes it difficult for him to see where the pattern begins to fail. In relationships, however, goodness without internal authority creates an imbalance that slowly reshapes the emotional dynamic. The man becomes increasingly focused on maintaining harmony, anticipating reactions, and preventing discomfort, while the woman becomes increasingly aware that the relationship depends on her emotional state rather than his direction. This does not make her feel cared for. It makes her feel responsible. The man mistakes his attentiveness for leadership, unaware that leadership requires the ability to tolerate tension rather than eliminate it. By avoiding conflict and suppressing his own boundaries, he removes the polarity that sustains attraction. Over time, his presence feels less grounding and more accommodating, less confident and more cautious. The woman may begin to test boundaries, consciously or unconsciously, not to provoke conflict, but to determine whether there is any internal resistance or strength behind his kindness. When none appears, respect erodes quietly. The man experiences this erosion as sudden or unfair because he has been consistent in his behavior. What he fails to see is that consistency without direction does not signal reliability. It signals dependence. As his efforts increase, his leverage decreases, creating a painful contradiction where doing more produces less. The relationship begins to revolve around emotional management rather than shared momentum, and intimacy becomes fragile because it is no longer anchored in strength. This is why the good man often feels blindsided when attraction fades. He did not change his behavior, but the meaning of that behavior changed as the emotional balance shifted, until he understands that kindness must be supported by self-direction, boundaries, and the ability to withstand discomfort. Goodness remains a liability rather than a strength, and without that understanding, the same pattern repeats across different relationships, regardless of intentions or effort. The real issue is not that being good is wrong, but that goodness without strength creates instability rather than trust. Kindness, reliability, and emotional awareness are not weaknesses on their own. They become weaknesses only when they are disconnected from self-direction and internal authority. A man who leads with goodness but lacks boundaries forces the relationship to revolve around emotional maintenance instead of shared direction. He becomes responsive instead of grounded, adaptive instead of decisive. Over time, this shifts the emotional burden onto the woman, who begins to feel that the relationship depends on her approval rather than his presence. This does not make her feel valued. It makes her feel responsible. The man, sensing distance, often interprets it as a signal to give more, to be more patient, more understanding, more accommodating. In doing so, he reinforces the very dynamic that caused the shift. What restores balance is not the removal of kindness, but the reintroduction of firmness. A man must be able to tolerate disagreement, emotional tension, and temporary discomfort without collapsing into explanation or appeasement. When goodness is supported by boundaries, it communicates stability rather than need. When kindness comes from choice rather than fear, it regains its power. The woman experiences this shift not as harshness or withdrawal, but as clarity. The relationship becomes less emotionally heavy and more coherent. The man no longer seeks validation through behavior, and the woman no longer feels responsible for his emotional state. This does not guarantee attraction or permanence, but it removes the pattern that quietly undermines respect. Understanding this allows a man to redefine what it means to be good, separating moral identity from relational strategy. Only then can kindness function as strength rather than liability, and only then can a relationship stabilize without constant emotional management.